It's no secret that I love my water cooler. It's one of those big gallon ones where you have two different spigots, one for cold, refreshing water and one for room temperature water. There's even a picture of me on Facebook, a selfie that I took with my water cooler the day that it was delivered. It's no secret. I love my water cooler. But I am aware that having cold, refreshing, delicious water on demand is a privilege. It's a privilege that I don't take lightly. It's really a luxury, considering how so many people in the world struggle to have access to clean water on a daily basis. Water is life, but it's something that we often take for granted in our daily lives. Water is life. It covers our planet and it makes up most of what we are. It's powerful and it's persistent, carving rocks, wearing them down, and carving out a new path, always finding a way, flowing and falling where it will, quenching our thirst and refreshing our land. Water is life to us and this place that we call home. Even though we can only go a few days without water, it's often something that we take for granted. We take for granted its life-giving power. We shower and we splash about in it like it's no big deal. But whether we acknowledge it or not, water is life to us in more ways than one. We enter the waters of baptism as creatures of both water and spirit. Whether we were brought to the waters of baptism as babies or we chose to enter it later in life, baptism is life for us. But, like the water in which we are baptized, it is often something that we take for granted. So this morning, we remember Jesus' baptism. We remember what happened then in order to make sense of what it means for us now. We remember Jesus' baptism and are invited to remember our own. Later in the service, I'm going to invite you to come forward to this bowl of water to remember your baptism. But this invitation to remember is more than just about recalling what happened on that day, no matter how long ago it was. Though it's part of it, remembering your baptism is more than just about the who and the what, or the how or the where. It's not about the actual details of the day. Because no matter how you were baptized, no matter how old you were when you were baptized, no matter how well you remember those details, remembering your baptism is about celebrating the all-encompassing and unconditional gift of God's grace to us. It's about remembering who you were, who you are, and who you are called to be. Remembering your baptism is about saying, "Here I am," and God responding in kind. Now, over the years, over the centuries, much ink and even a good amount of blood has been spilled over the various forms and formulas of baptism. There's been countless discussions and disagreements about the efficacy and meaning of baptism as related to sin and salvation. But we're not here to rehash those arguments. We're here to remember. Because what's important is that no matter how you were baptized, no matter how old you were, your baptism is beautiful. It's worth remembering, and it is cause for celebration. See, similar to how we have variations of baptism in our denominations, each of the Gospels, in their own way and in their own style, include an account of Jesus' baptism. Last week, I made the Sunday school class spot the differences between the different versions. I'll spare us that this morning, because this morning I want to focus in on the Gospel of Mark, on his dramatic account of what happened when Jesus entered the waters. Having spent a lot of time with Matthew and Luke through Advent and Christmas, it only seems fair to show Mark some love this morning. So, you heard Mark's account. Our scripture reading comes from the very beginning of Mark. Unlike Matthew and Luke, Mark doesn't waste time with shepherds and stables. There aren't any magi or mangers. Mark dives right in, quite literally, as we find ourselves on the banks of the Jordan River, with John the Baptizer standing there in all of his prophetic glory. A wild-haired, locust-eating, camel-shirted, leather-belted comic hero who declares himself unworthy to even untie the sandals of the one who is to come after him. And with that figure of John the Baptizer looming on the horizon, Jesus enters the scene and Mark takes off to the races. Mark's gospel is known for its frenetic energy. One of his favorite words is immediately. You'll hear it over and over again in his gospel. You heard one of them in our scripture reading this morning. Mark's gospel is fast-paced, and it's short on details. Like us, Mark is always moving on to the next thing, always eager to get someplace else. But it's worth taking a moment this morning, taking a moment here in the beginning of Mark's gospel, not to rush off to the next thing, but to sit and to soak up the meaning of this moment, to consider Jesus' baptism and to remember our own. Because in this moment, we find a communal confirmation, a holy commencement, and a powerful affirmation of our life together and with God. Mark opens with John on the banks of the Jordan River. And since Mark, like I said, is not one to waste words on superfluous details, every strange detail that we get about John speaks volumes. From his strange diet to his questionable fashion choices, John is a bridge from what was to what will be. He eats the honey of the promised land and the locust of the plagues. He wears the camel-haired shirt of Elijah, and he comes out of the wilderness, the same wilderness where the Israelites had wandered for 40 years before entering the promised land. John the Baptizer is literally dripping with symbolism. And it's no accident that John and Jesus meet on the banks of the Jordan River. The Jordan River is this boundary between the wilderness, what was, and the promised land, what will be. The Jordan River is this place of transition, of transformation, where Moses passed the baton of leadership to Joshua, and where Elijah passed the baton of prophecy to Elisha. Here, on the banks of the Jordan River. It's in all these colorful and concise details that Mark connects John with the entire history of the Jewish people and shows how Jesus is to the long-awaited Messiah, the one who is called to relieve their fears and fulfill the hopes of God's people. This is a communal confirmation. This baptism is God's promise fulfilled in Jesus. There's continuity and there's connection to the past, but there's also a beginning. The beginning of something new. It's significant that we meet Jesus here at the beginning. Mark begins with this baptism of Jesus because it's the beginning of Jesus' public ministry. All the Gospels have Jesus' baptism coming before any of his other speeches or lessons or miracles. This is the beginning, the revelation of Jesus as the Messiah. This is where it starts. In the waters of baptism. This is where Jesus is revealed as God's favored one. It's the holy commencement of a life committed to ministry in all of its forms. For when we, God's people, come to the waters of baptism, we come to our own Jordans. We come to that boundary between what was and what will be. And we enter it with full confidence that God is waiting for us on the other side. Because being baptized isn't so much about washing away what was as it is about entering into this new way of living, of starting something new. Now, I personally do not have any children, but from what I've heard from people that do, and from what I've heard from my husband who has delivered many babies, giving birth seems pretty messy. There seems to be a lot of fluid and substances of other thicknesses floating around. Things are slippery and they're awkward, right? From what I've seen, from what I've heard, it's weird. Yet somehow, despite the mess, despite all of the fluids, it's somehow breathtakingly beautiful. It's the beautiful start to a new life. And that is what is at the heart of our baptism. It's awkward. It's weird. It's sloppy and it's slippery, and yet it is beautiful. In all its messiness, we're reminded that we have been reborn as creatures of water and of spirit. In the waters of our baptism, we die to an old way of being in the world, and we're raised to new life. Raised to shine the light of God's love into the world. So when we come to remember our baptism, we remember. I ask you to remember that you were born to shine. Jesus was baptized at the beginning of his public ministry. And in that same spirit, our baptism calls us to live out our faith in the public sphere. By entering the waters of baptism, we say, "Here I am, ready to be vulnerable and exposed, ready to die to my selfish desires and to live out the love of Christ in the world." We enter into the waters of baptism and gain new life. Mark goes on to say what happened when Jesus came out of those waters. Immediately, as he was coming up out of the water, Jesus saw the heavens torn apart and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. Then a voice came from the heavens saying, "You are my beloved, my own. On you my favor rests. Jesus saw the heavens torn open. And again, Mark makes a profound statement in such a small detail. See, in the ancient cosmology, there was earth, which was flat, and then sky, and then on top were the heavens, where God lived. And just as we saw the Jordan River was this physical boundary separating the promised land from the wilderness, the sky was seen as this physical boundary between the land of people and the realm of God above. But here in this moment, in the waters of baptism, we see God tearing through that boundary. Mark makes it a point of using this word that means ripping apart, this tearing apart, and this closing of the distance between the land of people and the realm of God. As the Spirit descends, that separation is gone. It's a holy transgression against the things that keep us separated and divided from ourselves, from each other, and from God. Thinking about how God tore open the heavens, I can't help but think of those stories that you hear about people who did these incredible feats of strength, kind of the heat of the moment in crisis. You hear about a mother who tears apart a car to save her baby, or a neighbor that somehow finds the strength to lift up a piece of a building to rescue someone who is trapped. This is God tearing open the heavens. It's love that is desperate to reach out to the beloved, to close that distance. It's love breaking through the boundaries and pronouncing that you are loved. You are my own, my favored one. Remembering your baptism means remembering that you are God's beloved. It means remembering that God tore open heaven to meet you in those waters, to call you my beloved daughter, my beloved son. The waters of baptism welcome us into this family of God and into this beloved community. In baptism, God says, "Here I am. Here I am to guide you, to strengthen you, to encourage you, to call you my own." So I invite you to remember your baptism, beloved of God. Remember that you are as much a creature of water as you are a creature of spirit. Remember that God's grace washes over you, quenching your thirst and refreshing your soul. So, as we stand and sing our next hymn, or in a little bit, as we sing our final hymn, I invite you to come to these waters. The small little bowl that we have here on our communion table. I invite you to come here, to dip your hand in these waters to remember, and to take a stone. I know it sounds silly, but I want you to take this stone to remember that water is life, that baptism is life. And I want you to put it somewhere where we go and often take that water for granted. It's a silly rock. But I want you to put it in your shower, or by your sink, or on your coffee pot, or on top of your beloved water cooler. And I want this silly rock to sit there as a reminder to you that you are a creature of water and of spirit, that you are God's beloved, and that we shouldn't take that for granted. So as we stand and sing, I invite you to come forward and remember your baptism. Amen.